Guten Tag, buenos dias, bienvenue tout le monde. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Christina Robinson. I'm the engineering manager of one of the UI teams for Influx data on the cloud side. I'm super excited to be here. I'm fairly new to the team, and this is my second Influx days that I've attended, and the first one that I've been invited to for the other side of the pond. Okay, I'm here to talk to you about understanding and visualizing your data with Influx DB Cloud on the UI. So if we can go ahead and get started. So here's what I'm going to cover. Basically, soup to nuts, what you can do in the UI. The ingest part of it, hopefully you were able to attend yesterday's talk that was given by Jess Ingrassalino. She is one of my colleagues. She reports, we are all on the same applications team under Barbara Nelson. So she covered all the different ways that you can get data into Influx Cloud. So I'm not going to be talking about that today, but for completeness sake, everything you can do in the UI is ingest, explore, analyze, and act. So I'm going to be covering the last three. Next slide. So hopefully at this point, we're going to pretend that you have data inside your cloud account. So what can you do with it? Well, the first thing you want to do is you want to look at it. You want to explore and take a look to see what kind of data you have and where do you have it. So we have two main ways that you can do that in the UI. Our original way that we've had available since the beginning is the Data Explorer. The Data Explorer will be familiar to most of you who've been using our product using the UI, and it's available through the side nav bar, and we'll take a look at that in a second. And then the second way is relatively new. It's been in beta since the beginning of 2021, actually even a little bit before. And then we GA'd it very recently, and it's called Notebooks. And Notebooks is a companion way to take a look at how your data is structured. Next, once you have begun to take a look at how your data is structured, then you're going to want to save how all of that information is looked at, and that's where dashboards come in. And finally, the components of the dashboard are the visualizations themselves. So let's take a look at each one of those steps. Next slide. So let's take a look at the differences and the similarities between Data Explorer and Notebooks. Data Explorer and Notebooks both allow you to create simple query constructions of the data that's in your bucket. They also allow you the view capability of the results of those queries as visualizations. They also allow you to save those queries as dashboard cells or tasks. So those are the two primary ways that you're going to take a look at the bucket and construct those queries. You can use either the simplified method where we have data pickers, and you can go through, and I'm sure you've seen many examples of this already, including in the previous talk. And then you can select the different types of visualizations, and then you save the results. Or you can jump straight to our query builder where you can type in Flex yourself. What's new is the Notebook. Now, Notebooks has several different features. One, it has a streamlined table view. It has inline commenting. So as you're working and making choices about what filters you're going to use and what aggregations you're going to use and what choices you make for graph types, you can make notes to yourself directly in that area that you're building and making those choices. It also has the ability to save that interim work before you then save it to a dashboard cell or tasks so that you can go back to that and reuse it and share that work, as well as all those notes that led to that work among coworkers. So let's take a look at what notebooks look like. Next slide, please. So this is the notebook view, and I've kind of chopped it up because I didn't want to have like multiple slides for every little screen, but all of these are full screen views, and I've just kind of chopped up the portion, and the rest would be blank. So in the first upper left-hand corner, this is what you would first see. You're just going to see name your notebook. You're going to see a preview button and select a metric. So this is where you actually just select the bucket that you want to work with. It's a drop down, and on the next little graphic over, this is where I've actually dropped down and selected the bucket that I wanted to work with. So as soon as you select that bucket, then on the filtering bar, it then for you says, here are all the different things that you can filter on. So it will select all the different fields and all the different tags, fields and tags for you, as well as your measurements. So this little, and it's color coded so that you can kind of see the different things for you. I shouldn't say color coded. It is different colors, so you can just kind of scan down through the list and see things a little bit different rather than being all one different color and your eyes loses tracking as it goes down the list. So it kind of changes color gradually as you go down. So if I were to change that bucket, it would refresh for just a second, and then that filter list would change to represent the tags and the fields that were available for the new bucket that I've selected. So this represents, if you were going to the Data Explorer, this would represent the field picker that would be available all across the bottom of the screen for the Data Explorer. Now it's kind of hard to see, but once you select, you kind of put your mouse going down it, but once you go through the mouse, then you get the final screen, which is there's a little dot, and that's when the fields turn colors, solid colors, and that's how it tells you, okay, you've actually selected these to be filtered. Then if you go to the next screen, okay, so once you've gone to the next screen, then you get what we call the simplified table view. And that's what that upper portion is. And that upper portion just is a simple list of returned values of what you have filtered. And it just says, okay, if you were to filter on the things that you've selected, these are the types of values. And you'll see below the list, there's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way, because I had many, many results coming back from my filter. So it just selects for you a few of them, and then you can kind of go through and select. You can kind of tab through all the list. Now, down below there, I showed you just a little snippet, and I was able to pick, there's a kind of a purple, and then next to that, there's another drop down, and that's where you can pick the graph type. So this is where you say, okay, now that I have the results and I can kind of scan and see that's the results I wanted, then you can pick the graph type. And those are the same graph types that you would have picked if you had used the regular Data Explorer. So you would have graph, and you would have line with single stat and plot, band plot, all those different things. Those are just exactly the same ones. And then you can see the green button says export to dashboard. And you also, when you click that, you also have the option of saving as a task. Next slide. Okay. Speaking of dashboards, we do have some new visualizations. Now, these have been around for since the first quarter, but I wanted to talk about what their usefulness is. And this is a large data set, and I probably should have picked a smaller data set, but it's kind of a cool one. It's a fun one. So this is actually the NFL's 2021 season. So if you were to look all along the left-hand side there, that's all the different teams. And then along the bottom is their play dates. So we have representations of wins and losses. The red is the bye, and the orange is a tie. And what's interesting is about a mosaic allows you to graph non-numerical values. So that's the reason that you would want to use a mosaic graph. So it can show you in a single line represents a team, and then the non-numerical values are represented by a different color. So they can have a win, a loss, a bye, or a tie. And you can give them different tags. So we could take the same graph, and I can also collapse it and show everything in NFC East. And I could just show the AFC, the NFC, the NFC East versus the NFC West. You can just show it all different ways because of the tags that I can put on there. So it was a fun one to show you. Next. Okay, now here's a more serious one. Okay, so here is a repo that is showing the value of whether a pipeline is building correctly. So we have a list of different repos, and we have the main repo and the branch of the repo, and whether it was building successfully or not successfully, and you can roll it up. So this is the main branch, the main name of the repo, and then it's kind of its sub branches. So you can roll it up to its whole name of the repo, or you can break it down into the different pieces of it. And we also have one of these that shows the different various phases of a pipeline and whether the pipeline is failing, and Circle CI built in, we're working on doing this for Circle CI and all that kind of good stuff. So this is a more serious and useful representation of why you would want to use Mosaic. But again, it's non-numerical values, and you can have as many as, we have one that's like pass, fail, soft pass, meaning the tests failed, but they weren't non-blocking, and we have a couple of different statuses. So that's what Mosaic is useful for. And this was released back in February, I think. Next slide. The next one is the most recent visualization that we've released, which is geographical maps. And it was our first release, and we wanted to just get it out the door. And then we are going to have a very quick subsequent follow-on release to give us a little bit more flexibility. So right now, it does require hard coding a field that's a lat and lon as a pair, or you can pass in to Flux and have Flux calculate a geotemporal location as an S2 cell ID. So there's a couple of different math things that you can pass into Flux that Flux automatically calculates this S2 cell ID. There's a fantastic article on our website about geotemporal Flux. So anyway, this is a really cool thing that one of our developers did, and calculated the International Space Station trajectory on using our maps. So that has been released, and our follow-on is going to be out just real quick now. So that will remove the requirement for hard coding lat long, and you'll be able to pass in the field that you want. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that you've taken a look at where your data is and how to keep track of it with your dashboards, and the potentially starting and looking at notebooks, let's take a look at analyzing it. How do you analyze it, and what do you do with the data? So we'll look at flux and downsampling and some annotations. Next slide, please. So when I first joined the company, I'm a mathematician. That's my background. And I was like, what do you mean by downsampling? and Flux here in Fluxers constantly talk about downsampling, and it's just like a normal part of the vocabulary. So for those of you who have been here a while, I apologize, but those of you who are still new, I do want to give a couple of definitions. So downsampling is basically you have all of this high resolution data. So you may be grabbing data that is within nanoseconds, milliseconds, seconds, and it's just very, very high volume data. And although that data is very, very valuable, if you try to look at that data over time to do reports and trends, it's just going to be too much. So what you're going to do is you're going to aggregate it. You're going to sum it. You're going to say, I want to know the average of these buckets of data. So that's what downsampling is. And so once you take the sum or the mean of all of these different very, very, very high resolution, and then you say, okay, I'm going to take the average of these little things, take these little chunks, and then I'm going to just take the average or the sum or the mean or like whatever you're interested in. You can do standard deviations. You can do, there's so many different things that you can do mathematically. And then I'm going to save those and work with those aggregations and store those in a different bucket. And then I can get rid of the high volume, very noisy data and just work with my downsampled data. So that is what downsampling is. Why do you do it? So first of all, it reduces the overall amount, the volume, the disk usage, and the amount of volume that you're working with over time. So you can have, over here, you can have 30 days, 7 days, 3 days of really, really high volume data. And then over here, you can have 30 days, 90 days, forever of downsampled data. And then second of all, it improves your query performance. So when you're looking at really long-term trends, even shorter trends, midterm trends, if you're just dealing with really, really minute layers of temporal data that's gathered at milliseconds, nanoseconds, that's just too much data, even for the high-powered computers that we have today. So by aggregating it and working with those aggregation slices, it just becomes much more manageable to work with that. So you get your much, much improved performance. And you also eliminate the noise of so much volumes of data. So if you just have 1 million data points over here in this tiny, tiny, tiny little slice, and then you can downsample that to only 100 data points, then you get rid of just a lot of little unimportant little blips, because you're just looking at the much smoother overall information. So anyway, that's from a mathematician's point of view, the real high value of downsampling. So how do you actually do it? So here are the basics. You use a downsampling task, and you have your source bucket where you're just throwing every single raw event that happens. And then over here, you have your destination bucket. And you're going to create a task, and you say, I'm going to take from here, and I'm going to go over here. And this task is cycling. And so periodically, you're going to grab from here. You're going to take a big chunk of these things, and then you're going to perform some kind of function on them, whether that's taking the average, the mean, the standard deviation, whatever mathematical function it is that is appropriate for your business use case, and then store that over here in the other bucket that stores the lower data. And then you have a retention period that's over here where this data eventually just falls off. So small retention period over here for source data, polling task over here that says I'm going to go and grab my big chunk, do my crunching of numbers, and save the one result here. And that's how you downsample. Next task, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so you have this task that's running. How do you find it? Where is it? So let's talk a little bit about that. So on your left nav bar, there is a place where you can actually click on tasks. It has its own lovely little icon, and it'll list all the tasks. So when you create a task, you have to give it a name. So you go and find the task that is appropriate for the information you're looking for, and then you hover over it, and you get a lovely little screen, a lovely little icon, and it says you can look at its logs. See, there's a gear on the right of your task, and I've kind of highlighted the little box over the gear, and it says view task run. So I have there the task one, and I showed the gear and highlighting it, and it says view task run. So then you can go look and you can see all the different tasks run. It'll tell you when the task was run, and it'll tell you whether it completed, like where it ran and how long it ran. And then if you want to go even further, you can click down even deeper, and it will tell you all of the different steps that were run within that task. So if your task is composed of several steps, then it'll actually tell you the different steps that were run. So sometimes we get questions about, I don't know whether my task is running, and I don't know whether it ran successfully. How do I find that out? So this is a detailed set of steps for going through, finding your task, finding when it last ran, and whether it was successful, and all the steps. Next slide, please. So a new feature that we've just released is annotations. So if you are in the process, you have created a dashboard, you're looking at how the dashboard is running, and you find an anomaly, and you say, this just isn't looking correct. And you go and you do your research, and you discover, oh, there was an underlying outage at one of your plants, and they weren't reporting things correctly, and then all of a sudden you got a bunch of data in. So what you can do now is on your graph, you can actually add an annotation to that spike. So our annotations right now are added directly on the graph on a dashboard. They're per graph, per dashboard. So if you add an annotation on a graph in one place, it will not show up on that same graph if that same graph is shared someplace else. And it's sensitive just to the one place. So if you have that same incident that affects multiple graphs, you will have to add that annotation in multiple places. And it was designed that way, where this was just our first go at it, and we wanted to get some feedback to see whether people wanted to be able to add the annotation in multiple places, or whether just in the one area is good. So think of this like a sticky note. As you put the sticky note in one place that says, by the way, we had something that impacted, and we're just going to put a sticky note right there. So in order to add annotations, we have, this is only available right now in LineGraph and in LineGraph with SingleStat. So in all the other ones, if you try to click on the annotations enablement bar, the little hot bar that's right there next to variables, you will get the error will say, sorry, you can't do that. But if you're in LineGraph and you click on that, then you will see pop up the show annotations and enable one-click annotations. So you need to click on enable one-click annotations to actually start writing them. If you click on annotations and they're already on the graph, they will show up. Once you click on enable one-click, then you can just click on the graph and that will pop up the bottom left screen, which says add annotation. So wherever you clicked, that will be the start date. And then you will start typing to give it a message of some kind. And then you can click add annotation. And then the green bar, it'll appear like here in the middle, in the bottom middle. And if you hover over it, then you will get the description. So that is how annotations work. And if you unclick enable one-click annotation, it goes back to its original function, which is clicking begins the click drag function of zooming in a graph. So that's why we had to enable one-click annotation or not, because we wanted the zoom function to still work. All right, next screen, next slide. All right, so we've gotten data in, we've taken a look at the data, we have done some analysis on it, and now, so what? What are we going to do with it? This is where we start doing our checks and notifications and alerts. So now that we know what the behavior of the system is, we would like to potentially, or you as a customer, the user of Influx Data would probably want to set up things that say, hey, if this ever happens in the system, I want somebody to know about it so they can go do something. So that's where we set up our checks notifications. Next slide, please. And this was actually, I caught the end of the last talk, so this was talked about by Angus. So this is the flow if you use checks and notifications. So first you set up the check. A check, you have to write what check you want, and we have 3 different types of checks. We have a threshold check, we have a deadman check, and when you can write a custom check. Once you write the checks, checks are polling, so they run periodically, and if the check meets its criteria, it writes a status. The status then gets written to InfluxDB. You also have to set up notification rules. Notification rules are also polling. Notification rules poll and say, has a status been written? Has a status been written? Has a status been written? And if the status is met, then the notification rule writes a notification to InfluxDB, and it also, if it's been configured, also writes to a notification endpoint, which can be, for example, Slack, email, or PagerDuty. So that's kind of that's the architecture of InfluxDB. I mean, it looks a little complicated, but I tried to just simplify it as best as I could. All right, next slide. So what is the difference between a task, a check, and a notification rule? So this is where I'm going to try to lay it all out for you. So basically, they're all tasks. Under the covers, they're all tasks. Custom tasks are written, just regular tasks. Tasks are written to a user's bucket. Checks and notifications have to be written to the monitoring bucket. That underscore monitoring bucket is a system bucket. And that's how the system knows, oh, this is a special thing and it has to be done a certain way. Custom checks. So remember, I said there's 3 types of checks. There's deadman, there's threshold, and then you can have a custom check. So if you write your own custom check, you have to have a very specific schema. You have to use the monitor.check function, which is that polling function. And you can only use 4 different values: critical, crit, warn, info, and OK. That is the way that the system knows that this is a check, and that's how it writes the correct status. Custom notification rules. So we have a UI that allow you to write your own notification rules. It's very, very simple. But if you want to write your own, you again have to have a specific schema. You have to write to the monitoring bucket, and you have to set up your own polling interval. Now, we have a function that'll do that for you. And you have the choice of writing to a notification endpoint if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. So there is a beautiful article that's written by Anais that is I've referred to, that talks about all of this, like absolutely in detail. Next slide, please. And that is all I have. I am ready for questions.
Awesome, Christina. That was really great. Before we go into the questions, I just wanted to chat with you a little bit because, your section is all about exploring, analyzing, and acting. And what's interesting with the explore portion is that as you look at something like a template or you start playing around with notebooks, it seems like one of the easiest ways to learn things like Flux, right? Just kind of poking around in that UI. It just seems like a much easier way. You can just kind of play around with what you can see visually and then switch over to the query view and actually see how the queries are constructed. At least for me, that seems like a pretty easy way to understand. One of the cool things that you probably missed when you were talking about the geotemporal capability, and I was going to ask you if you had any ideas for good use cases, but Jamie, our Influx ace, has actually shared that he has a really cute use case, and he's going to build a Santa tracker, which I think would be perfect for geotemporal, so we can make sure that as Santa is flying through the sky, we can actually make sure that all the sensors on his sleigh are going to let us know that his, everything's working just right.
Well, there were some really cool use cases that I had so many. I had a hard time figuring out which ones to put in there. I had some folks do migration of birds. There was a really cool map for bird migratory patterns. I had one guy who was trying to track his fuel economy on his car. And so he had tracked like all of his routes from his house to his work. And so he was trying, so he had a map of all the places he went in his car. There are so many fun as well as practical. We have some great tech for people who have devices in their vehicles for fleets. And so they're tracking fuel economy for their vehicles and also maintenance for their vehicles. We have a ton for maps. I just was like trying to keep it to 1 or 2 because I was like, otherwise I'm going to be talking forever.
Exactly. Yeah. In fact, one of our community members shared with us that in their fleet management tool, they were able to determine that when the drivers were on their way home, the last 100 kilometers, they had a tendency to speed because everybody's anxious to go home. But then that's when their fuel consumption went up. And so by collecting that data, they were able then to come up with an incentive for the drivers. So if you're within 100 kilometers of home, then you get an extra, $100. If you stay, at the normal speed rate, so that you don't, use extra fuel. But you can't do that unless you collect that data, and that data is both time series as well as location-based data. It's such a cool use case, and it's just so fun. And I think now that we have it, I think we're going to see an explosion of cool use cases. So I apologize, I'm just rambling. I didn't mean to, but we do have a number of questions. And so Christina, let me just read them out to you and then have you answer them. And so Jamie asked, in terms of checks, the next evolution of deadman and threshold checks could be trend checks. Any plans to implement this, or do you foresee people using custom checks for this?
So I do know that we are in the process of completely revamping how we do our checks and notifications. So I will definitely take a note to make sure that we do trend checks, or make sure that we bring this feature forward, because this is a big hot button for us coming up soon.
It's actually a great idea, Jamie. So we should definitely bring you into the conversation a little bit more. So Solomon asked, is it possible that notification checks is already generated? This is to avoid sending the same notification multiple times. Yes, that dreaded flood of the same notifications.
Yeah, so we do have capability already within our system to avoid, and we have the ability to avoid multiple checks, and we kind of have it configurable. So you can say, okay, notify me if this condition happens more than X times, then don't notify me. Or if it happens within, if this specific rule occurs more than X times within Y period, then notify me. So we have all kinds of configurations to avoid multiple notifications on the same event. That's already available.
All right. So Chris asks, where are annotations saved? Is there an annotation summary file that we could download? That's a good question.
So right now, yeah, it is a very good question. So annotations are saved not to a bucket. So they are saved to an internal database. Right now, we do not have the ability to download a summary of the annotations. So if that's a feature request, we could potentially add that.
Okay. Jamie asks, how do you create custom checks? I can only see threshold and deadman in the UI, or do you create them straight as tasks?
Yeah. So basically, in my talk, there's an article, and it's a fantastic article, and it actually walks you exactly through. So you do basically create it straight as a task, and there's basically some straight code that you will need to have in order to have it function correctly as a custom check. You've got to have monitor.check in there as a function, and you have to make sure you return only the 4 value codes so that your status is written correctly. But anyway, I'm assuming this deck will be available. So I strongly encourage them to look at that article, because it's very, very well written, very straightforward. There's an example custom check in there written. And he'll have everything he needs in that.
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll also pop that link into the Slack channel so everyone can take a look at that sooner. Yes. Another question from, if you have hundreds of alerts to define, can they be programmatically set, like via a CLI or HTTP API?
That is a very good question. I'm thinking. I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't. So in order for them, so we have a CLI. But what I don't know is whether the CLI has the capability of setting an endpoint. Let me take a note. Let me take that back, and I'll have to get back to you because I have never tried to set an endpoint via the CLI. I don't even want to take a guess, but I'll take that back as a question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then as Christina mentioned, I do think it's worthwhile everyone take a look at, if you're new to Influx, take a look at that downsampling blog post that Christina was referring to. I think downsampling is, I think it's a lot easier in the newer versions of Influx. I think in the older versions it's pretty complicated and it got a little bit confusing. And the way that I like to think about it is that, at the end of the day, I mean, what's kind of funny about time series data is that in the real near time, in the moment of now, you need a lot of granularity with your time series. But then over time, what you just really need to understand is kind of the shape of the data. You don't need to have all those data points. And so downsampling will allow you to maintain that shape so you can understand, what was happening, but you don't have maybe that specific interval. So you just know that, there was a bump in a bunch of things happening with those metrics, and then it kind of came down. And as she mentioned, it's a great way to be able to save on your storage. And so being able to do that in an automatic fashion means you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about, oh my God, I have all this data. I got to, get rid of it right now. Just set it up and then just have it do this thing continuously. And so I would recommend everyone take a look at that article. And I think the other thing that I want to just quickly touch on is that a lot of these capabilities that Christina talked about were part of the collaboration release that we had. I guess it's already been 2 months ago. And really the intent of that release was coming up with a set of capabilities that you can use to help work on time series data with your team members, right? A lot of times we're collecting this data, but we're not just using it for ourselves. We're using it within the app that we're building with our other teammates. And so these capabilities, really help you to work together with the rest of your teammates. Hey, Christina, great presentation. Thank you so much. Like always, we really appreciate you, and we really appreciate your team and all the really great work that you have done and they have done.